Racist cop intimidates black lawyer. Regrets it when he finds out who she is. The hum of the engine filled the car as Maya Reed drove along the winding suburban street, her thoughts drifting to the evening ahead. It had been a long day, full of courtroom arguments, client calls, and the unending paperwork that marked a life in law. Maya, a seasoned civil rights attorney, was no stranger to long hours or high-stakes battles. Tonight, though, she looked forward to unwinding. The streetlights cast a gentle glow, and she relaxed into the peaceful night, allowing herself a rare moment of calm. Suddenly, red and blue lights flickered in her rearview mirror, shattering her tranquility. Maya's stomach dropped, a feeling she knew all too well. She glanced down at her speedometer, confirming she'd been well under the limit. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one tinged with a sense of dread and irritation. She was aware of how these situations often unfolded and felt a familiar resolve tightening in her chest. With a sigh, Maya signaled and pulled her car to the side of the road, parking beneath a streetlight. She took a deep breath, mentally bracing herself for the encounter. She knew the importance of remaining calm, of handling these moments with both composure and precision. As she gathered her thoughts, she reminded herself of one truth. She was in the right, and she would not be intimidated. As she waited, she could see the officer, a tall man with a rigid stance, approaching her car. She straightened, rolling down her window just enough to hear him. The intensity of his glare was immediate and unmistakable. This wasn't going to be a routine stop, and Maya could feel the tension thickening in the night air. The officer stopped just short of her window, taking his time as he looked her over with a gaze that held no warmth, only authority. Maya noticed the way his jaw tightened and his eyes narrowed, making his intentions clear. He wasn't here to simply do his job. He was here to assert control. "License and registration," he barked, his voice sharp and devoid of courtesy. Maya raised an eyebrow but complied, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She retrieved her license from her wallet and the registration from the glove compartment, holding both out to him without a word. The officer grabbed them without a thank you, glancing briefly at her name before his eyes drifted back to her face. "You know how fast you were going back there?" he demanded, folding his arms across his chest. His stance suggested he was ready for a confrontation, one he likely assumed he would win. "I was driving under the speed limit, officer," Maya replied, her tone even and calm. "If I was speeding, could you tell me how fast?" He frowned, clearly not expecting her to respond so assertively. There was a pause as he shifted his weight, his gaze hardening. "Don't get smart with me," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "You were driving erratically." Maya felt her patience thinning, but she remained composed. She had encountered men like him before, men who believed that their uniform gave them unchecked power. "I'd just like to know the specific reason for this stop," she replied, her voice unshaken. Her confidence seemed to throw him off balance for a moment, but he quickly recovered, narrowing his eyes as he leaned closer. "Well, Miss Reed, you're about to find out." Maya watched as the officer's face twisted in irritation. He took a step back, glaring down at her with barely disguised contempt. She knew that her calm demeanor was unsettling him, and she could feel the tension rising with each passing second. But she wasn't here to play his game. She was here to stand her ground. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, voice laced with a challenge. Maya hesitated, considering her options. She knew the law well and understood that under certain circumstances, officers could request this. But she also knew her rights. Her mind quickly assessed the situation. There was no legitimate reason for him to make this request. Yet, refusing could escalate things further. "Is there a reason I need to step out, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. A flicker of frustration crossed his face, and his fingers twitched at his belt. He was clearly unused to anyone questioning his authority. "Are you refusing to comply?" he asked, his tone dripping with warning. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm just asking for clarification, officer," she replied. "If you're making this request for a lawful reason, I'd be happy to cooperate." Her choice of words only seemed to deepen his anger, and he clenched his jaw, leaning closer to her window. "Listen, lady," he said, his voice barely controlled. "Your attitude isn't going to help you here. Now, Get out of the car. Maya could feel the tension twisting in the air, a silent battle unfolding between them. But she knew that backing down was not an option. She was prepared for whatever came next. With a silent nod, she reached for the door handle, prepared to face him on his terms. This confrontation was far from over. Maya stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she straightened to her full height. The officer, a good 6 inches taller than her, looked down with a smug expression. His posture radiated a sense of power, but Maya met his gaze with a steady, unflinching stare. "Hands where I can see them," he commanded, his voice laced with disdain. She raised her hands slowly, noting the other cars passing by, a few drivers glancing over curiously. Maya knew how important witnesses could be in these situations, and the thought reassured her. The officer walked in a slow circle around her, as if sizing her up. "You know," he began, a menacing smirk tugging at his lips, "people like you should learn when to keep quiet. I'd hate to see you make a mistake you'll regret." Maya's jaw tightened, but she refused to let him see her frustration. Instead, she allowed herself a small, confident smile. "People like me?" she echoed. "Could you clarify what you mean by that, officer?" He paused, his smirk fading slightly as he realized his words had revealed more than he intended. "Don't twist my words," he muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm just saying that some attitudes can lead to trouble. You don't want that, do you?" Maya met his gaze calmly. "I'm well aware of my rights, officer. I'd advise you to be careful with how you approach this situation." Her words hit like a challenge, and for a moment, his face flickered with uncertainty. He wasn't used to civilians standing their ground, much less someone with the quiet, unshakable confidence she displayed. This encounter was not going as he'd expected, and it was clear he was starting to realize it. Maya stood her ground, her steady gaze never leaving the officer's face. She could sense his frustration growing with every calm response she gave. His hand moved to the radio at his shoulder, and he clicked it, his eyes not leaving hers. "Calling for backup," he muttered, almost as if daring her to react. "Let's see how cooperative you are when more officers arrive." Maya's heart rate quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. She had prepared herself for this scenario countless times in her career, knowing that maintaining composure was her greatest asset in moments like these. The presence of backup officers didn't intimidate her. It only made her more resolute. She watched him closely, noting the subtle cracks in his demeanor. This wasn't about enforcing the law anymore. This was about a power struggle. He wanted her to feel small, vulnerable, outnumbered, but he didn't know who she was or what she was capable of. Not yet. After a few tense moments, another patrol car arrived. A second officer, younger and seemingly less tense, stepped out, glancing between Maya and Officer Walker, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He seemed to sense the tension in the air and shot Walker a questioning look. Walker didn't offer any explanation, just waved dismissively at Maya as if she were an unruly suspect. "We're just dealing with a difficult situation here," he told the new officer, his tone full of authority. Maya took a deep breath, then turned to the second officer. "I'd like to know the reason for this stop and the need for this backup," she said clearly, her voice carrying over the tension. "I have complied with every request." The second officer looked at Walker, his own discomfort apparent. Maya could see the cracks starting to widen. This was a game of power, and Officer Walker was beginning to lose control. The second officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Maya and Officer Walker. He looked young and slightly out of his depth, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Maya seized the moment, deciding it was time to take back some control. She turned to Officer Walker, her voice calm but edged with authority. "Officer, do you even know who I am?" Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension. Walker's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He hadn't expected her to challenge him so directly, nor had he anticipated that she might be someone of importance. His fingers flexed nervously at his side, the authority he'd wielded a moment ago slipping ever so slightly. "Am I supposed to?" He shot back, his tone laced with irritation but lacking the confidence from before. Maya could tell he was rattled, and that gave her an opening. "Yes, you should," she replied, her voice steady. I'm attorney Maya Reed. I specialize in civil rights and have extensive experience with cases involving racial profiling and police misconduct. She let her words sink in, watching as his expression changed from surprise to discomfort. I'm well within my rights, and I know every law you're trying to use against me. Walker's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the second officer, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Maya could tell he hadn't signed up for this kind of encounter, and his hesitation suggested he wasn't keen on being involved in a potential lawsuit. Maya took a step closer, her voice firm. I recommend you consider your next actions very carefully, officer. Any further harassment could lead to serious consequences for you and your department. She could see the impact of her words on him, his confidence wavering as he realized that this was no ordinary encounter. The power dynamic had shifted, and Officer Walker was beginning to grasp just how far out of his depth he was. Officer Walker's composure cracked, his confidence visibly shaken. Maya could see him processing her words, his mind working to reconcile the authority he wielded with the reality of who she was. He cleared his throat, attempting to mask his unease with a veneer of professionalism, but his body language betrayed him. "So, you're an attorney," he muttered, trying to regain his footing. "That doesn't mean you can talk down to law enforcement." Maya allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "I'm not talking down to anyone, officer. I'm simply reminding you of the legal boundaries of this interaction." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "As an attorney specializing in civil rights, I've seen far too many incidents like this, and I know exactly how they end for the officers involved." A hint of panic flared in Walker's eyes. Maya watched him wrestle with his pride, caught between backing down and digging himself deeper into a hole. The second officer, sensing the gravity of the situation, took a step back, his expression cautious. "Look," Walker said, his voice lowering, the edge gone. Let's not make this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Just cooperate, and we can both be on our way." Maya raised an eyebrow, unamused. "You initiated this big deal the moment you pulled me over without cause and escalated it by calling for backup. I cooperated from the start, and in return, you tried to intimidate me." She folded her arms, her stance unyielding. "But I won't tolerate being harassed, not by you or anyone else." She could see him struggling, his jaw tightening as he realized he was in over his head. Her calm, unshakable presence had stripped him of his authority, leaving him vulnerable. For the first time, he seemed to grasp that his actions could have real consequences, and that the woman before him was more than prepared to see it through. Officer Walker's face was a mix of frustration and dawning realization. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was a situation he couldn't simply control by force or intimidation. Maya could see the internal struggle in his expression, pride fighting with the uncomfortable awareness that he'd made a grave mistake. "Look, Ms. Reed," he began, forcing an even tone, "I'm just doing my job. If you felt inconvenienced, that wasn't my intention." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Inconvenienced?" she repeated, her voice incredulous. "I was stopped without cause, ordered out of my vehicle, and threatened with arrest for asking questions. That's not an inconvenience. It's harassment. And let me assure you, officer, I know the difference." The second officer took a step forward, his voice tentative. "Maybe we should de-escalate," he suggested, his eyes flicking nervously between Walker and Maya. He seemed to grasp what Walker hadn't, that Maya wasn't going to back down, and that this confrontation could have serious repercussions. Maya addressed him directly, her tone softer but still resolute. "Thank you for that, officer," she said. "De-escalation is exactly what should have happened from the beginning." Walker clenched his fists at his sides, his face darkening with resentment. "So, what? You're going to file a complaint? Try to ruin my career?" Maya held his gaze unflinching. "I don't have to try, Officer Walker. Your actions tonight speak for themselves. But I'm not here to ruin anyone. I'm here to make sure that officers understand that the people they serve deserve respect, regardless of how they look or who they are." Walker's face paled slightly, the weight of her words finally sinking in. He looked at the second officer, as if searching for support, but the younger man only shrugged, distancing himself from the unfolding mess. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and Maya knew she had made her point. The officer who had sought to intimidate her was now struggling to save face, trapped by his own arrogance. The second officer, who had stood to the side until now, looked visibly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncertain about his role in the encounter. Maya noticed his hesitance and saw in him a glimmer of awareness, an understanding of the gravity of the situation. "Officer," Maya addressed him directly, her voice calm but authoritative. "You arrived as backup, but I think you can see what's happening here. I've done nothing to warrant this level of response." The young officer nodded slowly, casting a wary glance at Walker. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice low. "I understand." Walker shot him an irritated look, clearly feeling betrayed by his colleague's subtle show of sympathy. Maya noted the tension between the two officers and sensed that the second officer wanted no part in the escalation that Walker had initiated. "Thank you," Maya replied, nodding at the younger officer. "It's important that everyone in this situation remembers their duty, to serve and protect, not intimidate and harass." The second officer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight now on him. "Of course," he said, avoiding Walker's angry glare. He looked back at Maya, a trace of regret in his expression. "I think we've, done all we can here, don't you think, Officer Walker?" Walker looked ready to snap, his face reddening as he grappled with the realization that his partner was subtly urging him to end the encounter. But Maya could tell that Walker's pride wouldn't let him concede so easily. He clenched his jaw, struggling to maintain control. The younger officer, noticing Walker's stubbornness, turned back to Maya. "Ma'am, we'll let you go now," he said, attempting to defuse the situation once and for all. Walker was visibly seething, but Maya knew that the tide had turned in her favor. She had not only defended herself, but she had also made an impression on the second officer, an ally she hadn't anticipated. Maya could feel the shift in the air, the tension crackling as she stepped into her role as an advocate. She turned to face both officers, her gaze settling on Walker, who was still bristling with frustration and resentment. "Let me explain exactly what happened here," she began, her tone measured and professional. "Tonight, I was stopped without a clear reason, treated with disrespect, and subjected to intimidation tactics. All of this falls under racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power." Walker's face tightened, but he said nothing, clearly aware that he was on thin ice. The younger officer looked uneasy, but listened intently, seemingly aware that this was now beyond a simple traffic stop. "I want you both to understand," Maya continued, "that these aren't just words. What happened here tonight violates both department policy and civil rights laws. Under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, I could file a claim against you for violating my constitutional rights. These laws are in place to protect citizens from exactly this kind of abuse." The younger officer nodded, clearly absorbing every word, while Walker remained stony-faced, his silence thick with resentment. Maya took a step closer, her voice calm but firm. "I've represented clients who went through similar situations, but in many cases, they didn't have the privilege or knowledge to defend themselves. That's why I'm here, because someone has to stand up to this kind of behavior." Walker shifted uncomfortably, the authority he'd once held over the encounter slipping further from his grasp. Maya could see the impact of her words in the way his face grew pale, the gravity of potential legal consequences sinking in. "This can end one of two ways," Maya concluded, looking directly at Walker. "Either you learn from this and treat people with respect going forward, or you face the consequences of your actions tonight." Walker remained silent, his expression tight, but the second officer's look of understanding was enough to reassure her that her message had been received. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with the weight of Maya's words. Officer Walker's face was a mask of simmering anger and bruised pride. Maya knew that, deep down, he recognized the mistake he'd made, but his refusal to concede only fueled his frustration. In a final attempt to save face, Walker spoke, his voice cold and clipped. "Look, Ms. Reed, maybe you think you're above the law because you're a lawyer, but that attitude doesn't give you special privileges. You're still required to follow the rules like everyone else." Maya met his gaze unfazed, Being a lawyer doesn't give me special privileges, Officer Walker, but it does give me a deep understanding of the law, an understanding that tells me you crossed several boundaries tonight. And if anyone's attitude has been an issue here, it's yours. The younger officer stood a few steps away, his eyes darting between Maya and Walker, clearly uncomfortable. He seemed caught between loyalty to his partner and the knowledge that Maya was in the right. Maya sensed his inner conflict, but decided to press on. She needed to make sure her message was clear. "I'm filing a formal complaint," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "I'll make sure that your department is fully aware of your conduct tonight. I'm also prepared to take this further if needed." This kind of behavior is exactly why so many people have lost faith in law enforcement. Walker's face flushed with anger, but he said nothing. The younger officer glanced at Walker, visibly nervous but subtly nodding, as if silently encouraging Maya to proceed. Maya saw this and took it as confirmation that she was making an impact, not just on Walker, but on those around him. "This isn't just about me," she continued. "This is about every person who's been mistreated by someone in a position of authority. If you think you can intimidate people into silence, then you're in for a rude awakening." The moment was thick with finality. Walker clenched his jaw, visibly realizing he was in over his head, his silence speaking volumes. The weight of Maya's words settled heavily on Officer Walker. His defiance faded, replaced by an expression that teetered between frustration and fear. For the first time since the encounter began, he looked at her not with arrogance, but with an uneasy respect. He took a deep breath, glancing down, as though considering his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice noticeably softer. "Look, Ms. Reed, Maya, let's not blow this out of proportion. Maybe things got a little out of hand, but we're just doing our job. It's tough out here, you know?" Maya raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his sudden change of tone. She'd seen this tactic before. Officers attempting to humanize themselves only after realizing the consequences of their actions. She wasn't about to let him off so easily. "My job is tough too, Officer Walker," she replied evenly. "And every day, I encounter people who feel the impact of power misused. This isn't blown out of proportion, this is accountability." Walker's eyes darted around, searching for an ally, but his backup officer stood silent, his expression unreadable. Maya could see the flicker of fear in Walker's gaze, the realization that his career, his reputation, even his authority were at stake. "Maya," he tried again, his voice almost pleading, "I apologize if you felt harassed. That wasn't my intention." Maya's expression remained steely. "Intentions don't excuse actions, Officer Walker. I hope you understand that the damage from tonight doesn't disappear with a simple apology." He nodded stiffly, looking down, his pride wounded but his resolve broken. He seemed to finally understand that he couldn't intimidate her, that Maya was not just another civilian who would be cowed into silence. She'd won this encounter. But her victory wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who needed to be heard and respected. And she could see in his eyes that he knew it too. As Officer Walker's apology hung in the air, the sound of murmuring voices grew around them. Maya turned to see a small crowd that had gathered nearby, their faces reflecting curiosity and concern. Some held up phones, recording the encounter, capturing every word and gesture. They had likely been drawn by the flashing lights and the intensity of the exchange. Maya's heart swelled with a sense of purpose. She knew that this was bigger than her, bigger than any single interaction. It was about holding authority accountable and demanding respect for all people, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. She raised her voice, ensuring it carried to everyone watching. This is exactly why accountability is essential in law enforcement. No one should have to experience harassment or intimidation, and no one should feel they're at risk simply for standing up for themselves. The crowd's eyes were fixed on her, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging looks of silent solidarity. Maya could feel the power of their presence, the support in their gazes. It gave her strength, and she knew that what had begun as a solitary confrontation had become a moment of collective empowerment. The younger officer, still standing nearby, glanced at the crowd, his face reflecting a mix of realization and discomfort. He seemed to understand that this encounter was no longer just a private matter. It was a public statement, a reminder that people were watching and that actions had consequences. Walker's face had paled, his expression tense as he glanced nervously at the recording phones. He seemed to sense the impact this scene would have if it were shared beyond this street, the gravity of his actions amplified by the eyes upon him. With a final look at Officer Walker, Maya spoke calmly but firmly. This isn't just about tonight. It's about the change that needs to happen everywhere. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Maya could feel the power of their support, a collective call for respect and accountability. Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card, her name embossed in sharp, professional lettering. Maya Reed, civil rights attorney. She extended it toward Officer Walker, who hesitated before taking it. His hand trembled slightly as he held the card, the weight of her words and the consequences of his actions settling in. "This is my contact information," she said firmly, her gaze unwavering. "You can expect to hear from my law firm soon. I intend to file a formal complaint, and I'll be following up to ensure that an investigation is conducted into your actions tonight." The crowd watched in rapt silence, and Maya felt their presence bolster her strength. Walker's face was a mix of resentment and resignation, but he didn't argue. For once, he seemed to realize that further resistance would only dig his hole deeper. The younger officer, still standing a few steps away, looked at her with something akin to respect, nodding slightly as if to acknowledge the importance of what had just transpired. As Walker opened his mouth to offer a weak protest, Maya raised a hand to stop him. "Consider this a warning, Officer Walker," she said, her tone sharp but controlled. "Think very carefully about how you treat people in the future, because next time, it might not be someone with the resources and knowledge to defend themselves." Walker swallowed, his face reddening as he processed her words. He shifted uncomfortably, finally realizing that Maya's goal wasn't to ruin him, but to ensure that he learned a valuable lesson. A lesson in humility, respect, and the responsibility that came with the power he wielded. With a nod to the younger officer, Maya turned to face the crowd, speaking so that everyone could hear. "This is how we make a difference," she said, "by holding people accountable and standing up for what's right." The crowd murmured in agreement, their faces alight with admiration and solidarity. Maya knew this night had been a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who deserved justice. As Maya returned to her car, she glanced back at Officer Walker one last time. His face was tense, his pride clearly stung, but there was a shift in his expression, a glimmer of understanding that hadn't been there before. He stood by the side of the road, watching her with a mixture of resentment and newfound humility, realizing that this encounter would likely stay with him long after the night ended. The younger officer approached Walker, placing a hand on his shoulder and speaking quietly. Maya couldn't hear their exchange, but the look on the younger officer's face suggested he, too, hoped Walker had learned something from the encounter. A few members of the crowd had started to disperse, but others lingered, watching Maya with respect, their quiet presence a symbol of solidarity. Maya took a deep breath as she sat in her car, the weight of the night's events settling over her. She had faced down prejudice, asserted her rights, and reminded an officer of his duty to serve, not intimidate. It wasn't the first time she had to stand up against authority, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But knowing that she'd made an impact tonight gave her a sense of fulfillment, a reminder of why she'd chosen this path in the first place. As she started her engine and prepared to leave, she caught a glimpse of Officer Walker's reflection in her rearview mirror. He was still watching, his expression thoughtful and subdued. She hoped he would carry this experience forward, that he'd think twice before treating anyone else with the same disrespect he'd shown her. Driving away, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road to justice was long, but every step mattered. Tonight, she'd taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd been made to feel small, for everyone who deserved to be seen and respected. This was how change happened, one encounter, one stand, one lesson learned at a time. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this powerful story of standing up for what's right. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Your support helps us bring you more stories that matter. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.